former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, you are most welcome on the Capital TV show. Let me start about what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. You were a former chief of the Pentagon. How do you assess this war, and what are the predictions of its conclusion?
Well, thank you. I appreciate being on your show. First of all, I'll start at the end. I don't make predictions, but I'll give you my sense of what I think is happening. Unfortunately, Mr. Putin has started something that I think he's going to regret for many reasons. It's going to put, as it already is, put Russia in a terrible spot. And Russia will be dealing with the consequences of this for many years to come, not only trade and economic, but just general relationship problems that they're going to continue to have. And Russia right now has no allies. I mean, it has relationships with China and other countries, but not allies. What the Ukrainians are doing is quite amazing. Mr. Putin made about 3 fundamental mistakes. He overestimated the ability of his army. He underestimated the ability of the Ukrainians. And third, he underestimated the West, that the West would come together and stay together, NATO, EU, all the Western European nations. And
so it was a big mistake.
A big mistake, and he's suffering those now. As to how this ends, how, when, where it ends, I don't know, but it will end, and it'll be a diplomatic ending, and we have to let the Ukrainians lead on that, but continue to support them in every way with the continuation of yesterday, the president announcing $1 billion more.
Our audience are mostly from the Middle East, so let's go on the Gulf state or Gulf countries, and they want to know your opinion on the visit of President Biden to, there is a summit in KSA. What do you expect from it? And you have importance, or you have always emphasized the strategic importance of the Arab Gulf countries. 16th of July, President Biden will be in Saudi Arabia. What is your expectation about it?
Well, first of all, I think it's the right thing to do. I think President Biden has made the right decision. He's not only going to be, as you know, in Saudi Arabia, but he'll be in Israel. He'll meet with the Palestinians. That's all, I think, very important, because the region of the Middle East is a vital area of the world, not only because of its oil and natural gas, but where it's located and relationships. So we're going to have to build that Saudi relationship back. And I know, and you know, and I'm sure all your viewers know, that the problems that the Saudis have had and the concerns we've had with Saudi Arabian conduct, their foreign policy and other issues. But the world is far better off when the United States works with and has relationships with not only Middle Eastern countries, but other countries. But the Middle East is an important area of the world, and we need to stay engaged in it. And I think President Biden's right.
Do you think that the Biden administration miscalculated the importance, strategic importance of the Middle East, and now in U.S. Foreign policy agenda, and now they are trying to fix it? It was a tragic mistake.
Well, that awareness came about obviously through the situation the world finds itself in with not enough oil. I mean, with the Russians being sanctioned and the Europeans cutting off oil, people aren't pumping oil. The United States of America is the largest producer of oil, and Saudi Arabia and Russia are the 2 top exporters of oil in the world. And it wasn't just Ukraine in the sanctioning of what Mr. Putin did in Russia, but it was also 2.5 years of COVID, and that stopped a lot of activity. People didn't travel. So spending and demand for gasoline, natural gas, it went down. And the oil producing countries, they responded to that lessening of demand. And it takes time to build that back up, because the Middle East is so critically important on production of oil,
but only
they
this,
have to build it back up as well.
or also there is a strategic defense history or cooperation. It has to be continued on and on.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I made no secret of this, and I was opposed to the invasion of Iraq. I said at the time that it would totally turn the Middle East upside down, and it has. The Middle East today is as dangerous as it's ever been, whether it's Syria, whether it's Libya, whether it's Yemen, Iraq. Iraq still hasn't been able to form a government because of Iran. So they've had a lot of problems, and we have to be careful with our power, our partnerships, our relationships. And that brings me back full circle to a comment I made earlier, that we need to put back relationships, because it's dangerous. The world is dangerous, and more dangerous when the world is absent from relationships, when the United States doesn't have relationships. So you're right. I mean, that relationship with Saudi Arabia has been a strategically important defense and foreign policy relationship.
Axios published recently that the Biden administration is ready to give certain commitments to the United Arab Emirates as part of an agreement, but it's still unclear how far the U.S. will be willing to go. Your approach on this?
Well, I think, again, it's the same approach that I've mentioned and I've always believed in, that you've got to work with other countries. Every country is different. That's where you start. Every country has to be respected. If you have countries like Russia, where the poor people of Russia are captive to its leadership, to Putin, then that's a difficult situation for us to build a relationship with leaders that represent what Mr. Putin represents, and because the people themselves suffer. So I think what the United States is doing, working with the UAE as well, is again, it's the right thing to do. We've got to remember that the world is changing so rapidly. The world's been turned upside down over the last few years. Everybody's off balance. And then when you enter a new situation like a war that's affecting everybody, nobody's unaffected by this Putin war in Ukraine. Famine. Can't get 20 million tons of grain out of Ukraine to help people in Africa and the Middle East.
Yeah.
And so the world is now so interconnected that when you have wars, when you have any kind of activity, everybody is going to be affected in some way. So the more the United States, and I think all nations, can work together in common cause. We're always going to have differences. That's just the way our backgrounds are different, and we all got started differently. But that doesn't mean you can't cooperate and find the common interest, because that was the beginning and the reason for the post-World War II world order that we built. Common interest. World Bank, IMF, collective security, NATO, World Trade Organization, which was evolved as well from tariffs and trade treaties. All of those collective interests were put together after World War II based on common interests of all people. All people would benefit. All people economically would prosper. All people would have education. All people could be free. And it's imperfect. We didn't accomplish all that. But we've not had a World War III, and we've not had a nuclear exchange. Every leader, let me finish. Every world leader, when they went to their graves, were concerned about a World War III or a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States. So we've had a world order that's worked pretty well. We now need to build a new one.
The United Arab Emirates had already an agreement with France that includes a commitment, defense commitment, if the UAE is attacked. Is it a reaction for the disappointment that the UAE they have when the Houthis attacks their land with no reaction from the United States?
Well, I don't think there would be no reaction from the United States. I don't think that's the case. I mean, Saudi Arabia is attacked. If UAE is attacked, there'll be reactions. How the diplomatic relationships move and what the interests of each of the countries are in relationship to their own defense, their own security, that's for the diplomats to work out. But we've worked very closely with the UAE, the United States, over the years. Trade agreements, financial agreements, and working with their military, training here in the United States. So, yeah, I don't think that it's a matter of if UAE is attacked, that the United States doesn't do anything, or that's won't be the case. But each situation is different, and the United States, as does the UAE or any country, has to analyze their relationships on their own individual basis and relationship.
But during the Trump administration, they put the Houthis on the FTO list. When Biden came, he removed it. So I don't think that this administration is so tough on Iran, and they recognize that Iran is a real threat for their allies in the Middle East. Recently, they are putting people and entities on sanctions. So they just now are acting when the negotiation in Vienna went to nowhere, and there is nothing imported on the table. They didn't get any achievement. So what do you think?
Well, I don't agree with you that the United States isn't doing enough with Iran to push Iran back to the table to try and re-engage and essentially rewrite the 2015 nuclear agreement. I don't think the United States, this administration particularly, has been weak on Iran. I don't see where that is evident anywhere.
So what is the situation right now between USA and Iran and the JCPOA reviving it?
Well, I think it looks pretty bleak that it's going to be able to be renewed. That's not because of us or our partners. As you know, it wasn't just the United States that signed that agreement. It was France, Britain, Germany, Russia, China, all signed that agreement, not just the United States with Iran. But because of the war, because we've sanctioned Iran and still have severe sanctions on Iran until they get more serious. So I think it looks very unlikely that the 2015 JCPOA is renewed. I wouldn't say it's dead, but everything I know about it and the efforts that we've made, and we've made very strong efforts, but Russia has backed out of it, China has backed out of it. I don't know if that's forever, but right now, for the near term, near future, it doesn't look good.
You've met the leaders of UAE during their tenure as the Secretary of Defense. What is your opinion of the leadership of Mohammed bin Zayed? He was a crown prince, now he's a president. What do you see about the future of this country?
Well, what he's done, and all leaders of Middle Eastern countries or any country, is going to look out for the interests of their people and the interest of their country first. I mean, we do. Every country does, and that's something that's not only legitimate, but it's important, because when you sit down to negotiate with anybody or develop relationships and finding common interests, as I said, you know that's where they're coming from. You know that MBZ is going to put his country and the country of his people first, as we do. But that doesn't mean you don't cooperate. That doesn't mean you don't trade. That doesn't mean you don't have mutual agreements on training pilots and so many things that we do with some of the countries in the Middle East. So, you know, I think he has always looked out for his country. We don't agree on everything, but we don't agree with even our closest allies on everything, and because we have different perspectives, and we come from different backgrounds and how we see the world. But again, that doesn't mean that you can't cooperate and have a relationship.
You supervise the campaign against ISIS. What views do you hold now to stop extremism from taking roots in the Arab world and the Islamic countries?
Well, I think that's a good example of why relationships in the Arab world are important for us and for the world. You're going to always have terrorism. That is not something new. I mean, since men and women have populated this earth, you've had different forms of terrorism. So that's not new. But how do you deal with them in a very sophisticated world that is now dominated by the sophistication of technology and drones and artificial intelligence? The only way you can do that, no one country is strong enough or has the capability to do it alone. And you do that again through relationships, through partners. It's not in the interest of UAE or Saudi Arabia or any country, Iraq, any country in the Middle East, certainly Iran, to have the threat and the reality of ISIS in your country and doing terrible things. So that's a common interest that you have, and I think that's the first thing that you got to understand when you're dealing with terrorism of any kind or at any level. It's not just indigenous to certain parts of the world. Some terrorists are, but terrorism is everywhere. I mean, there's no country that is not dealing with some kind of terrorism.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think you start.
This is why I'm going to ask you about the international court to sentence Hariri killers. Yani our prime minister, Lebanese. So we have a sentence for life, and this is newly happened. The latest news. How do you see this will reflect on the situation in Lebanon? Does Hezbollah gonna give these two killers? And it was like Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. It was a planned murder and assassination of Prime Minister Hariri. How do you see do you have any vision for Lebanon? How do you see this sentence?
Well, I knew Rafiq Hariri, admired him very much for what he did in Lebanon and his influence in the Middle East. It was a terrible tragedy what happened to him in 2005. I know his family as well. What the ICC, the International Criminal Court, did was the right thing to do. And the latest news coming out today about two of those who were involved in that assassination, who were convicted in international criminal courts. We should do everything we can to get those people back and punish them. I think it'll be very unlikely that that's going to happen with Hezbollah and with the Iranians. As to the future of Lebanon, I don't know. It's a tragedy. The leadership in Lebanon have let their own people down over the last 15 years. They've corruption, stolen from the people, and they've allowed this to occur. What's occurred, especially since former Prime Minister Hariri's assassination. So the leaders there, and many of them are still in power, have to take some responsibility for this. In fact, the majority of the responsibility for the sad state of affairs that Lebanon is in. Lebanon is a beautiful country, lovely people, and it's terrible as to what has happened. How we fix it, it's going to have to be fixed within. You're going to have to find enough leaders who are courageous enough to try and get it turned. It won't be fast. It won't happen quickly, because so much has happened over the last 20 years that it made it difficult. But you've got to start somewhere to get the kind of leadership to turn it around. In everything in life, leadership matters.
It's important.
And if you got bad leaders, you're going to have bad results.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Chuck Hagel, thank you so much. I was so glad to have you, overwhelmed by your presence in our show. Thank you, really, indeed.
Well, thank you for doing this, and my pleasure. I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey. Hey, Maria Malouf here. Please click to like and subscribe to Maria Malouf TV YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.